Well, I'm excited to be kicking off this year's Colloquium series. When Dr. Britton invited me to speak about my research, I was at a bit of a loss regarding which bit I should trot out. As with how spread my objects and methods of study are these days, I seem more and more to be moving from a place of interdisciplinarity toward one of anti-disciplinarity. However, I realized that I could use this space to talk about a couple of things which I'm calling pet projects and pet theories that interleave a few objects and methods of study I keep coming back to. So I hope you'll indulge me as I share some music about which I'm excited, but also attempt to demonstrate how that music gestures toward a pet theoretical framework I've been working with and the potential utility of the intervention it offers. As my title suggests, the music I'll focus on is courtesy of contemporary artists Thundercat and Louis Cole, both polymath musicians making hard-to-classify music in Los Angeles. Both Angelenos and prodigious instrumental virtuosos with wide and deep training, I discuss these two as representative of a larger musico-cultural ecosystem that you should absolutely check out. Well, what I'll describe as a metamodern cultural logic in their music is a kind of informed naivete, an oscillating both neither of modernism's optimism and utopic striving with postmodernism's cynicism and waning of affect. However, before we get to them and the more theoretical bit of my talk, I feel it's important to back up a bit and demonstrate what for me is the problem I'm attempting to address. So let's start with a couple of examples and ideas to set our collective expectations. So figure 1 here is a quote from David Foster Wallace's 1996 experimental novel and millennial doorstop, Infinite Jest. He writes, "It's of some interest that the lively arts of the millennial USA treat anhedonia and internal emptiness as hip and cool. It's maybe the vestiges of the romantic glorification of Weltschmerz, which means world weariness or hip ennui. We are shown how to fashion masks of ennui and jaded irony at a young age where the face is fictile enough to assume the shape of whatever it wears, and then it's stuck there, the weary cynicism that saves us from gooey sentiment and unsophisticated naivete. Sentimental equals naivete in this continent." Figure 2 is a quote from Ernst Bloch, that great cartographer of the utopian continent. "But I believe that we live not very far from the topos of utopia, as far as the contents are concerned. That island does not even exist, but it is not something like nonsense or absolute fancy. Rather, it is not yet in the sense of possibility. That it could be there, if we could only do something for it. Not only if we travel there, but in that we travel there, the island of utopia rises out of the sea of the possible. Utopia, but with new contents." Figure 3 is, of course, a meme demonstrating the impasse at hand, namely modernism's impulse to flex the capacities of imagination in pursuit of new, meaningful worlds up against the endless regression of a hermeneutics of suspicion that characterizes so much theorization of the arts, and that's also manifest in so much of the cultural logic of postmodernity. This image suggests that either something's got to give, or perhaps we require a new affectual map of the possible that shows this impasse as a false dilemma. Figure 4 is a video from Mononeon, the virtuoso bassist who mixes up found content with super groovy and often microtonal music couched in a slacky internet cultural aesthetic. Mononeon's work has a whiff of what I'll call the metamodern. He's seen here with footage of Matthew Silver.
Fidget widget of love! Widget! My fidget! With love? With a fidget widget love? Love! Love!
Matthew here.
I have it! I have it! Yes, 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 yes. We are loved! Yes! You're perfect! We're perfect just the way we are! We're perfect! That's right, you're perfect! You don't have to do anything! Just be you! Be you!
And finally, figure 5 is that same Mono Neon, who's done a short treatment of a Louis Cole tune. Note how the video opens with that postmodern slogan, "Who cares?" It's not a question here, it's an assertion. Having set the table a little bit, I'd like to engage in a little personal archaeology that sets up the logic and motivation of this pet project. Before I was this august early career scholar here before you, I made a living mostly as a saxophonist. And as for my musical taste, I was kind of late to the game. It was only in my early 20s that I was radicalized by exposures to various mid-20th century experimentalisms, from John Coltrane's late period to Frank Zappa to the AACM to Milton Babbitt, the Stooges, Arthur Russell, etc. It's a very long list. But living in Chicago at the time, I started going out to as many experimental shows as I could, and there were a lot of them. Like anyone that goes to a lot of weird art or music shows, I started learning that, well, they're not all great. In fact, a lot of them aren't great. But the ones that are great are really, really great. I once posed a question about this to drummer Frank Rosalie. I wonder if he gets that a lot. Frank was omnipresent in the city, playing 5 nights a week, mostly in dive bars and ensembles or alone, for hardly any money and for hardly any audience. One night I was checking out his set and I noticed that I was one of only 2 people that had come out. And he and I weren't friends per se, but we knew one another, and afterward I thought it fair to ask him why he was compelled to keep pursuing this super aesthetically challenging musical practice that didn't pay and had hardly any audience. If you're expecting a cliche art for art's sake answer, you won't be entirely disappointed. Unironically, he told me something like, and these are my words, not his, this was at least 15 years ago and I don't remember it exactly, but he said something like, "In a post-industrial, neoliberal, crypto-fascist technoculture informed by the logic of endless production and consumption for the purposes of the manufacture of consent and mollifying an ever less informed and uncritical population that's been made to distrust one another through the intentional cultivation of race and class warfare by a ruling class relying on the inscrutable oppression constitutive of its instrumentally constructed economy of scarcity, this is the only way I can feel alive." Now, it's important that you remember that's not really what he said. But I'd been reading a bunch of stuff at the time, and well, that's kind of what I heard. He did, however, say something like that, and that his musical practice, as challenging as it was, or perhaps because of how challenging it was, functioned as a lifeline for him. It wasn't only art for art's sake. It was a practice that sometimes broke open the concretizing system of systems he experienced as a broadly distributed affectual and economic oppression, postmodern, a space to engage with the, quote, real. And for him, just like for listeners, some nights weren't great, but some nights were transcendent. His statement certainly resonated with my own engagements with music and the aesthetic in general, but I struggled to make sense of how or why music worked that way. I wondered then, as I still do now, what was this character or capacity of our engagement with art to break us open and refigure our understandings of reality? How or to what degree is music expressive of emotion? What constitutes the musically beautiful? What does it mean to be moved by musical experience? Fast forward 15 years and I've gone pretty deep down that rabbit hole, studying various musicologies, critical theories, interpretive strategies, and playing and listening to a lot of challenging music in between. My objects of study have varied, but have often been some kind of experimental or popular musical practice after 1950, so naturally I found myself wading through reams of aesthetic theories, old and new, dialectical materialist approaches of culture and transformations of capital, loads of post-Heideggerian ideas to try and make better sense of music's efficacious weirdness. I found that much of the stuff available for talking about music after 1950 leaned heavily upon ideas of the postmodern as theoretical and periodizing frameworks, either explicitly or implicitly. And these theories were confusing and exciting. And of course, I was smitten and quickly drank the Kool-Aid. So while the postmodern in music usually refers to musical techniques like pastiche, parataxis, parody, deconstruction, irony, etc., they also point to difficult to pin down cultural logic, something I'll call, borrowing from Raymond Williams, a dominant structure of feeling or social experience in solution. This was further characterized by a waning of affect, or the sense of coming to an end, particularly an end of history, as declared by Frederick Jameson and Francis Fukuyama in The Universalization of Liberal Democracy and the Logic of Late Capitalism. In its totalization, this postmodernism seemed to preclude the idea of utopia from the contemporary social imaginary. The postmodern impulse to disintegrate, dehistoricize, and disavow meta-narrative allowed no space for utopic imagination, either as undiscovered island or hoped-for futurity, and the postmodern critique of high modernism, by extension, understood utopian desire, which is about to become pretty important in this story, as dangerously monolithic and worthy of a suspicious side eye. One would take these assertions to be doubly true for anything being made in Los Angeles, that prototypically postmodern city famously theorized as such by post-Marxist urban theorists Mike Davis, Rainer Banham, Norman Klein, and Ed Soja. After all, it's arguable that who you are and what you are is a function of where you are. Hence, anything coming out of Los Angeles should itself be postmodern, or, if not immediately recognizable as such, theorizable by relation or negation, right? Well, maybe not. Postmodern's whole end of history thing didn't mean that things stopped happening, only that certain constellations of value and meaning production seemed to be concretizing en masse, universalizing, totalizing, with closed horizons of meaning and possible alterity. So here's the, quote, problem. Postmodernity, or at least a totalizing caricature thereof, was telling me that the horizons of possibility had been foreclosed upon. Sure, we can amuse ourselves with new synthetic wholes pieced together from what we find while reveling in the rubble of previous archives of meaningful symbols, but even that yearning for meaning, as Foster Wallace suggested, reeked of those cultural sins, sentimentality, and naivete. But what about Frank Rosalie's paraphrased statement I mentioned before about the efficaciousness of his musical practice and all of the unexpected sincerity to be found hand in hand with despair in internet culture, pop music, and corners of new media? Perhaps rather than an end of history, we've witnessed rather another bend in history. Even Fukuyama has made statements recognizing the fragility of liberal democracies and structures that facilitate globalized trade, not only of goods, but of cultural values and artistic practices. And Jameson has published loads about the ongoing vicissitudes of utopia. History, as the continued dialectical movement of human affairs, it seems, is back and open for business. This reanimation shows that while we may have lacked a vernacular to articulate alternative horizons of sociocultural structuring during the postmodern period, that doesn't mean that those horizons ever really went away. They were merely obscured. And in this postmodern period, I believe the spaces of music and art are the best places to locate the working out of that new vernacular. More than that, I suggest it is precisely the role of our engagements with the aesthetic through music and other arts to cast toward the as-if, the not yet, the utopic, even as those arts are bound up in systems of capital informed by object-oriented ontology and reductionist economies based on ideologically informed transactions of value equivocation in the market of symbolic goods. Addressing this issue in his book, Cultural Capital, The Problem of Literary Canon Formation, John Guillory asks, is it possible to translate the false philosophical problem of aesthetic value into these ecological problems of cultural capital? I would like to propose an affirmative answer to this question, but with the qualification that the translation always has a remainder, which is nothing other than aesthetic experience. This statement implies that even as the arts are bound up in the conceptual cages of market transvaluation, that whole art as commodity thing, as well as the restricted demands of mainstream aesthetic vernaculars that structure music, TV, film, and internet culture, there's something unaccounted for. Yeah, something unaccounted for. Aesthetic experience. Aesthetic experience has been the boogeyman in contemporary aesthetic theory since Kant's radical subjectivization of aesthetics in 1790, his critique of judgment, which precluded it from any place as knowledge or facticity. We who try to science about music here in Musikwissenschaft have never figured out exactly what to do with it either. Now, I've got opinions about that, but that's for another talk. The important thing here is to take seriously that remainder of aesthetic experience, for that unaccountable polysemous and subjective phenomenon is what fuels the motor of meaning in the music of metamodern artists. So then, after having further set the table, let's get to actually talking about Thundercat, Louis Cole, and the Metamodern. You'll notice in both of their musics a broad sampling of genre markers and sound terms, a disregard for highbrow and lowbrow classifications, slippage between irony and sincerity, the influence of internet culture, DIY aesthetics, self-parody, and an oscillation between cynicism and sincerity. So let's start with some relatively older examples of their music. First, Louis Cole's song Mean It, published to YouTube in 2016, and with a little more than 1 million views at present.
Louis Cole.
Yeah. And now some bits of Thundercat from a few years ago. First him on absurdist entertainer Eric Andre's show, and then his song Captain Stupido from his 2017 album Drunk.
Ladies and gentlemen, here to have a good old-fashioned bass-off, Thundercat! First, Hannibal's robot! Thundercat! Hannibal's robot!
So this being a musicology colloquium, after all, I'll offer a little bit of musical analysis. Harmonically speaking, excuse me, much of this music is informed by modal harmonic structures normalized in the 1960s and more oblique harmonies from the jazz fusion period with a splash of more, quote, functional harmony from R&B and pop. Cluster chords, suspensions, slash chords connected by stepwise planing motion and symmetrical structures, are glued together by thick, repetitive bass lines and drums and bass or hip-hop flavored percussion. Both favor high male vocals and background vocals influenced by the aesthetics of the Beach Boys, Prince, and Steely Dan. We also hear a distinct 1980s pop production aesthetic, especially musical timbres and textures borrowed from video game and cartoon music. Production favors a shiny studio feel and sometimes the intentional self-conscious use of tape warble or glitches similar to vaporwave, wherein the listener is reminded of the technological mediation of their experience. Taking a cue from classic descriptions of American minimalism in the 1960s, we might call this sort of harmony non-dialectical, in that it eschews feelings of closure or the teleological narrative contours informed by erotic desire built into, quote, functional harmony. Rather, our experience is one of being buffeted about on a musical surface that can sometimes, especially in tunes with quickly moving harmonic rhythms, lack a feeling of depth. The listener skips along on this bouncy surface of shifting harmonic topography, buoyed by a quickly moving harmonic rhythm and dense polyrhythmic beats. There's certainly a feeling of traveling in the music, but not always a feeling of moving or arriving. So why am I attempting to describe this music as metamodern? What the heck is the metamodern? So let's get to that. The word metamodern has been used before, but the theoretical framework I'm deploying was first described in 2010 in a publication, here we are, by Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van den Akker, both working on their PhDs at the time. These two had noticed a change in the tone, the structure of feeling, evinced in a number of media and art spaces during the 2000s. They've written, now that history appears to have once more been kickstarted, the postmodern vernacular has proven increasingly inapt and inept in coming to terms with our changed social situation. This goes for discussions of history as much as it goes for debates about the arts. We can think here of the waning of a host of different postmodern impulses, which nonetheless share some kind of family resemblance. Pop art and deconstructive conceptual art, punk, new wave, and grunge cynicism in popular music, disaffected minimalism in cinema, spectacular formalism in architecture, metafictional irony in literature, as well as the whole emphasis on a dehumanizing cyberspace in science fictions of all kinds. Moreover, since the turn of the millennium, we have seen the emergence of various new, often overlapping aesthetic phenomena, each of them characterized by an attempt to incorporate postmodern stylistic and formal conventions while moving beyond them. Meanwhile, we witness the return of realist and modernist forms, techniques, and aspirations. So, to be sure, much of the music coming out of Los Angeles can be described in terms of formal structure, affect, mode of performance, and various engagements with capital as postmodern. However, I'm suggesting that many are beginning to surpass or supervene the postmodern and demonstrate a new structure of feeling. Both Thundercat and Louis Cole engage in self-parody and patronizing humor, Cole sometimes even using "who cares" as a slogan. But it's clear that in answer, they care. They care a lot. So in spite of the static nature of music previously described and the common feeling of resignation, there's an insistence to keep making music. And to me, this indicates an implicit belief in the promise of arts as if, as an indefatigable hope for the future in the face of postmodernity's resignation to a lack thereof. This all attests to a structure of feeling in ascendancy that supersedes the dominance of the postmodern. For examples of this, let's check out Louis Cole's short song, Money, first published to YouTube in May of 2019, and that presently has about 500,000 views.
Evolution takes a break. Green becomes the only race. Freedom fades so far away, and the grim we don't care how much I'll give the truth, not tell it out. I don't wanna even see without a bed. Money, won't let it mess me up. Money, some freedom is enough to
Woo! Yeah, Cole is unabashedly sincere in this song about his engagement with music making, asserting that he'd do it even if he had no money and assumedly no audience. Thundercat's song Show You the Way from 2017's album Drunk is another affirming, sincere song, even more so in this video whose narrative follows a man whose arms were chopped off in the earlier video for his song from that record, Them Changes, as he works to overcome depression and engage with the beauty of life. Note that this song also features Michael McDonald and Kenny Loggins, known to most millennials via that genre that for them is beloved, but couched in irony, yacht rock. There's a negotiation with sincerity at foot here, one that's attempting to rout the postmodern impulse to couch it in irony. It's useful to remember Umberto Eco's note about this from the postscript of The Name of the Rose. He writes, I think of the postmodern attitude as that of a man who loves a very cultivated woman and knows he cannot say to her, I love you madly, because he knows that she knows, and that she knows that he knows that these words have already been written by Barbara Cartland. Still, there is a solution. He can say, as Barbara Cartland would put it, I love you madly. At this point, having avoided false innocence, having said clearly that it is no longer possible To speak innocently, he will nevertheless have said what he wanted to say to the woman, that he loves her, but he loves her in an age of lost innocence. But rather than engage in this kind of posturing, I believe that both Thundercat and Louis Cole are attempting to lean hard into sincerity and innocence. Their music breathes vulnerability and speaks innocently, trying to communicate unmediated love and joy through the fog of cultural obfuscation they have inherited. For example, just check out Thundercat's love letter to Tron, his cat, in his song and video for Tron's song, or his love of Japanese culture in his song and video for Tokyo. And talk about being gormless.
Restless nights in Tokyo. Wanna hear all the sounds and see all the sights, from the Champs-Élysées to the Gundam Cafe. Gonna eat so much fish, I think I'm gonna be sick. Gonna blow all my cash on anime. Yes. Don't try to stop me, cause I'm over 9,000. Just point me to the pachinko machines. I think I'm Ichiro, I think that I'm Goku. Can I just stay one more day? Reckless nights in Tokyo.
So yeah, a metamodern framing, I think, is helpful here. Understood as an informed naivete or pragmatic idealism, a metamodern structure of feeling is not characterizable by traits of either modern or postmodern subjectivities. Rather, it's a paralogical both-neither that, as such, oscillates between ostensive antinomies of enthusiasm and irony, hope and melancholy, empathy and apathy, unity and plurality, totality and fragmentation, purity and ambiguity. And it's worth noting that Thundercat and Louis Cole aren't alone here. There are a lot of contemporary artists working in this space here. I've got a list of some. I think there's a lot of great listening here and watching hours and hours. And it's worth noting that a lot of these folks are also in Los Angeles, though not all of them. All right. So in spite of the end of history suggested by postmodernity's rejection of telos and meta-narratives in general, the metamodern recognizes the ascendancy of a cultural impulse to sincerely create works that function as if an historical horizon still exists, and as Bloch demands in his quote with which I opened, earnestly that we make move towards it. Metamodernism is then a heuristic label as much as a periodizing term. It is a structure of feeling that emerges from and reacts to the postmodern as much as it's a cultural logic that responds to today's stage of global capitalism. As such, it's shot through with productive contradictions, simmering tensions, and negotiations of ideological formations. And here comes a rather theoretical part. These contradictions are occasioned by metamodernism's inherence in a state of metaxis, a state of a paralogical in-betweenness that is both and neither. Vermeulen and Van den Acker deploy this idea of in-between to characterize a double bind, comprising a contemporary utopic desire that is aware of its own futility, but moves nonetheless. They offer, metamodernism moves for the sake of moving, attempts, in spite of its inevitable failure, it seeks forever for a truth that it never expects to find. The metamodern thus willfully adopts a kind of donkey and carrot double bind. Like a donkey, it chases a carrot that it never manages to eat because the carrot is always just beyond its reach. But precisely because it never manages to eat the carrot, it never ends its chase, setting foot in moral realms that the modern donkey, having eaten its carrot elsewhere, will never encounter, entering political domains the postmodern donkey, having abandoned the chase, will never come across. The metamodernism, that it moves for the sake of moving, rather, resonates with how I've described some of the musical elements in Thundercat and Louis Cole's music, but also in the sincere mode of making music in despite of implications in systems of capital and commodity culture, attempting to be more than content in the meat grinder of commercial music spaces. In a longer talk, I might be able to unpack a bit of the significance of their use of musical strategies from the Black radical tradition, featuring elements of free improvisation, a focus on intuition, and the assertion of the agency of the subject implicit therein. This is no small thing and definitely deserves further theorization elsewhere. I love this meme. Yeah, so let's go back to a couple of those other musicians I was talking about. So saying that I have this list of musicians and a few other media, many but not all of which are based in Los Angeles, who I would argue are working in a metamodern mode. Note that the metamodern is not the fulfillment or denial of the persistence of the cultural logics of the modern or postmodern. Rather, it is a becoming, it is becoming a noticeably dominant structure of feeling among others. There are hours of good listening and viewing here that seem to be doing some kind of work that's illegible from a strictly modern or postmodern framing. All right, moving for the sake of moving, as described above, seems to be efficacious for many of these artists in a way that, for them, connects the aesthetic to the social and ethical, offering glimpses of alternatives outside present realities characterized by ontological closure. In a Blackian sense, their musical practices are a path to the utopian as a means by which they might transcend the dominating systems they inhabit from within, potentially augmenting listeners' understandings thereof in the process. Again, this all points back to my non-quote from drummer Frank Rosalie, which suggested that in spite of being obstructed in their pursuance of meaning and alterity in a reality constructed and maintained by postmodern logic, those obstructions are not impermeable. And for us, this means that we, like them, are not bound in systems of value and meaning characterized by unbreakable ideological concretization or closure. Rather, this music evidences an ontology of openness, if one struggling under the logic of late capitalism. In his book on utopia and science fiction, Frederick Jameson opines that our imaginations are hostages to our own mode of production, and perhaps to whatever remnants of past ones it has preserved. It suggests that at best utopia can serve the negative purpose of making us more aware of our mental and ideological imprisonment, and that therefore the best utopias are those that fail the most comprehensively. Characterized as a metamodern double bind between the disillusionment of postmodern life and the promise of the utopic impulse, Metamodernity's impossible possibility reflects this new cultural logic's reboot of history. In spite of its acknowledged end in the postmodern period, this discourse reflexively takes toward a new telos as if history exists, moving for the sake of moving, animated by an impulse to seek a horizon it perhaps never expects to find. In spite of the presence of the logic of late capitalism and the structures that characterize post-postmodernity, the world is not closed, and aesthetic experiences occasioned by musical works still have the power to refigure our horizons of understanding, still holding out the heuristic promise of the as-if. Metamodern music, then, isn't a solution to the postmodern problem. It's likely not really even movement. It is, however, emblematic of the present moment and a cultural logic wrestling with the limitations of its immediate precursor and, in doing so, attempting to redescribe itself from within. As a means by which to redeem sincerity from postmodernity's ironic hall of mirrors, we can recognize metamodernity's ratification of the power of aesthetic experience to move, and otherwise change our comportment toward the world in ways that may spur action as much as reflection. To that end, I'll finish by sharing a bit of a performance of I Love Louis Cole, Thundercat's recent song that innocently and sincerely declares his love for his friend, heard here from a concert in San Francisco in March of this year. And then I welcome your questions and further discussion.
Wherever you are right now, Louis, I love you, man. Always. So this goes out to Louis Cole. This is called I Love Louis Cole. Let me say good morning, my friend, about let me know that I'm not crazy. 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 This is his.
All right, thanks again. Thanks for being here. And please be in touch if you have questions. I would love to hear about those questions, comments. And thanks for your time.